for me to say. For not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say. Not for me to say.
Good evening, Mr. Just put everything in the oven, Carlo. It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's It's not for me to say. It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do. Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
it's not for me to say.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do. Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
it's not for me to say.
Hello, Karen. Good morning. We're not hearing you, Karen. No, I don't know if you have your sound cut off or if it's a problem of how. Karen, please give us some seconds for us to figure out what's happening, okay? And sorry for this inconvenience. You can hear me, Karen. Okay, can you speak so we test if we can hear you?
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
Okay, do you have your mic on? So Pedro is trying to solve the problem. We don't know what it is.
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's not for me to say.
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
Bom, a Karen abandonou a conferência, vai tentar voltar a entrar. Que o problema que estamos a ter foi resolvido.
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's not for me to say.
Good evening, Mr. Just put everything in the oven, call on love.
Go with the brothers who you know how we do. Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers who you know how we do.
It's not for for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
it's not for me to say.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
Hello, Karen. Yes, we can hear you. I think technicians must do up the sound because it's a bit low, but at least we can hear you. So welcome back. So, Karen, we're going to start our conference. We're gathered here for the closing conference of the event Primeiro Encontro Nacional de Jornalistas de Meios Regionais, and the conference we're having is titled Cultivating Audience, Trust and Community, the Experiences of UK Local Journalists in the Coronavirus Pandemic. This conference will be delivered by Professor Karin Wald-Jorgensen, which I will briefly present. And Karen, I'm going to do that presentation in Portuguese for the benefit of our audience and also not to massacre the English language. And then we'll get back to English and to your conference, okay? So, a professora Karin Wald-Jorgensen leciona na Escola de Jornalismo, Mídia e Cultura da Universidade de Cardiff, é vice-reitora para a investigação e cultura na mesma universidade e diretora do Center for Community Journalism. Nesse âmbito, realizou recentemente uma extensa pesquisa sobre as experiências dos jornalistas comunitários, incluindo durante a pandemia do coronavírus. Tem trabalhado, além disso, em projetos de investigação sobre mídia populista de direita e desinformação. Como investigadora, interessa-se pela relação entre cidadania, mídia e emoção e como ela é afetada pela rápida mudança tecnológica e inovação. A professora Karen está a trabalhar em novos projetos de investigação sobre mídia populista e de direita, sobre deepfake e jornalismo comunitário e lidera o projeto de investigação O impacto da pandemia Covid-19 nas startups de jornalismo comunitário no Reino Unido. É autora de 5 livros: Emotions, Media and Politics, Digital Citizenship in a Datified Society, Disasters and the Media, Journalists and the Public e Citizens or Consumers. Editou também 5 livros, incluindo o muito célebre Handbook of Journalism Studies e também Mediated Citizenship, ambos pela Routledge. Publicou mais de 100 artigos em revistas e capítulos de livros e é comentadora sobre tópicos relacionados com a cidadania e os mídia nos mídia anglo-saxónicos. A conferência de hoje da professora Karen intitula-se Cultivando a Confiança do Público e da Comunidade, as experiências de jornalistas locais do Reino Unido na pandemia do coronavírus. Karen, welcome. Thank you for your presence here, although virtual presence. I have finished your presentation and the audience is eager to hearing from you. So you have the stage.
And I am so sorry that I'm unable to be with you today. I would rather be with you in lovely Portugal than here in my study back home in Cardiff, but in the spirit, I'm there with you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Yes, and you can all see that. Could I ask anybody who has their mics on to mute them if at all possible? so I don't get the interference on the line. Okay, so what I'm here to talk to you about today is research that pandemic. So, um, if you're attending this conference, chances are that you are strongly invested in and believe in the importance of local and regional news. For me, as an academic who studied this for some years, I'm very interested in local news because I see it as essential to a successful democratic society. And I'm certainly not alone in this. So, scholars around the world who have investigated the role of local journalism have found that the decline, which we've seen across Western democracies in local journalism, has had serious consequences for the health of local communities. What we're seeing across the board is that local newspapers now often tend to publish less political news. We're also seeing that the closure of local newspapers is correlated with a decline in electoral participation and also accountability in local politics. So basically, what seems to be happening is that as the resources of local and regional newspapers decline, as they're able to employ less reporters, then one of the areas that is inevitably downgraded in terms of coverage is that of local politics. So we see less coverage of things like local council meetings, local planning applications, and also the behavior of local politicians. These kinds of topics, which have been the traditional um, uh, part of the sort of what we call bread and butter of local journalism, these have been in decline. But nevertheless, what you see certainly in the UK is that local news continues to be highly trusted. So a YouGov poll in the UK from 2018 showed that 75% of those polled trust local newspapers, um, whether they're online or print. And these kinds of patterns in terms of trust have only been magnified or confirmed after the emergence of the global coronavirus pandemic. So, a World Without News study from October 2020 found that 66% of people appreciate and value journalism more since the global coronavirus pandemic began. So, I think that what I understand from my reading about the Portuguese context, I think that you have a similar pattern in Portugal to what we've seen in the UK. And that is one where regional and local newspapers have not fared well. So they've been in great difficulty for some time now, in part due to quite a rapid decline in advertising revenue, which seems to have been hoovered up, which seems to have been taken by big online players like Facebook and Google, for example, who are able to deliver more personalized advertising, and therefore have kind of undermined the basis for a lot of the advertising revenue that has traditionally supported local and regional newspapers. Um, Now, one development that has happened as a result of, and also in tandem with the decline in local and regional newspapers in the UK, is that it has opened up a space for a new type of local news outlets. And that's what I focus on in my research. So I am looking specifically at the experiences of local news entrepreneurs. And I just want to provide you with a little bit more context about what that means and who it is that I'm studying, because I think that you have some similar providers in Portugal, and you have some similar trends as well. But just to tell you a little bit more about the context that I'm studying here. So the kinds of outlets that I'm studying in my research tend to have been mostly established since 2010. Of the mainstream news industry. So they set up their own outlets. Now, these in the UK are sometimes called community news providers. Some people call them hyperlocals, and I think that's a term that's also used in Portugal. However, the journalists themselves tend to see themselves as local journalists. So they don't tend to like labels like hyperlocal or community news. They tend to, for the most part, describe themselves as local journalists. Is there someone who's able to put themselves on mute to avoid an echo here? Okay, so I'm getting a bit of an echo here, but that's not possible to address.
Sound is great. So if the echo you're hearing, it's not manifesting in our session.
Are you getting an echo also?
No, we're hearing you fine, quite fine.
Okay, I'll try to ignore the echo then.
I believe our tech guys are trying to solve it, but the sound here in the session is pretty good. So if you feel up to, you may continue.
Okay, great. I'm going to continue. Um, as long as you can hear me well, I will try to ignore my own echo. So a lot of these outlets are relatively new. They're relatively small in terms of their geographical reach, but collectively they tend to reach significant proportions of the population. So a total of 14.9 million in the UK, which is a fifth of the population overall. However, a lot of these newly established outlets tend to be quite financially precarious. They're often operated by just one individual. That individual often does it as a kind of volunteer activity, um, sometimes supported by another day job. And what that means essentially is that for a lot of these outlets, even though they're relatively newly established, like other startups, their existence is under continuous threat. At the same time, like other entrepreneurial businesses, they tend to be quite agile and flexible because of their small size. What that means is that they can rapidly innovate and change their ways of working. So some of the local journalism startups that I've studied have developed very successful business models. Many of them rely on advertising revenues. Many of them rely on partnerships with local businesses. Others have membership schemes, and others rely on philanthropic funding. Across the board, this new sector is seen as potentially quite important in terms of addressing a kind of perceived gap in knowledge of the local community. They're seen particularly as being important in terms of fostering new and locally based forms of participation and also holding local authorities to account. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what these outlets actually look like. So I'm just going to give you a second to look at these, and then I'm going to get myself some earplugs so I don't hear my own echo so much. Okay, so you should now have had a chance to look briefly at some of these sites, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about what they're actually like. So these are 4 of the sites of the community news outlets that I studied, and they represent different models in terms of their business models, but also different types of content. So if we look at the top left-hand corner, this publication, the West Leeds Dispatch, is run by a former journalist for The Guardian, so a major national newspaper, but it's run with the assistance of a team of volunteers in the community who have been trained to do journalistic stories. On the upper right-hand corner, we have the Inkspot newspaper, and the Inkspot newspaper is run by someone who works full-time at my university, Cardiff University, in community engagement, but at the same time runs this as a site to highlight positive activities that happen in her community, which is called Splot, and is a deprived neighborhood in Cardiff. So these 2 outlets at the top of this slide represent kind of new hybrid forms of news production that might be different from more traditional news outlets. At the bottom, we see 2 more established and commercially successful outlets, and these are the Caerphilly Observer and the Shetland News. So just to explain each of them in turn, the Caerphilly Observer a regional journalist who has actually been quite successful in terms of raising advertising revenues and in terms of creating a membership scheme as well. And then finally, we have the Shetland News, which is an online news site in the wealthy island Shetland. And it's very commercially successful because the community in which it publishes is a very wealthy one. So there are many advertisers who are willing to contribute to the success of this publication. So what I wanted to show with this slide was that when I talk about local journalism in Polynorus, it means a wide variety of things and a wide variety of diversity of models for how to make it happen. It means that you see a combination of volunteer-run outlets, ones that are done by people who have a day job as a hobby, but then also very professional publications which tend to be quite commercially successful. So just to explain to you a little bit about my research and what I've actually done. So with 2 of my colleagues, Julia Bölle and Garcia Blanco, I've done a series of in-depth interviews, very long interviews, with members of the UK-based independent community news network.
Independent Community Network is a network of very well-established community news organizations or local news entrepreneurs. It's an organization that has a total of 123 members. So you can see that we actually managed to interview almost half of all the members of this organization. And we did these just after the first lockdown between July and September 2020. Secondly, we did a survey of 116 community journalists. And respondents to the survey were recruited from a total population of 217 editors. So the population that we studied there was a broader population, which also included slightly less well-established outlets. So for our survey, we actually managed to reach more than half of the entire population. And I want to now take you through some of the most important findings of our research with reference to the kinds of issues that you've been talking about throughout your conference. So I want to first of all touch on a general impact of the pandemic on these local news organizations. And in doing so, I want to put across the point that the pandemic represented severe financial and logistical challenges to the local news entrepreneurs, sometimes causing an existential threat. At the same time, some outlets actually benefited from the pandemic, in some cases through increased funding opportunities, in other cases in terms of increased audience engagement and recognition. And I then want to give a few examples of how, within that context, journalists worked to cultivate trust and to strengthen their communities. So you can all still hear me because the echo seems to have disappeared. Yes? March 2020 caused an immediate and pretty catastrophic collapse of local advertising revenue. What we saw was that among the outlets that I studied, 14.2%, so 2 in 5, are not just online outlets, but they also produce a print edition. And those were really strongly affected. The ones that put out a print edition were really strongly affected by the lockdown. Because the lockdown meant, first of all, in addition to the collapse of local advertising revenue, you saw the closure of printers, so nobody to print the paper. You saw the closure of places where these outlets tended to distribute. Community, but that was suspended as a result of the pandemic. Then what we saw was that a total of 62% of all of the outlets with print editions completely stopped publishing during the pandemic. Now, in the UK,
think you probably had a similar scheme in Portugal. I'm not sure, but a lot of countries did. So a lot of businesses in the UK benefited from that furlough scheme, where they were able to let people stay at home and not work and still have their wages paid. But because of the fact that most of these outlets were run by one person, and most of them were quite small in terms of their financial turnover, that they didn't meet the government threshold for income in terms of the size of their business. What that meant was just 13.8% of those outlets that we surveyed were actually able to furlough staff. So in most cases, they did not get any government support as a result of the pandemic. So what then did these organizations do to adapt to the pandemic? Well, many of them really had to change what they did. In one particularly heartbreaking case, and this is a case of the West Leeds Dispatch, so the site that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Let me see if I can go back to it here. So the West Leeds Dispatch is the outlet that's on the top left of the slide. So the West Leeds Dispatch had planned for a very long time, for months and months and months, that they wanted to put out their first ever print edition. So ever since the West Leeds Dispatch was launched, it had always been online only. But the editor had this idea that it would be really nice to put out a print edition, and that would be a kind of special edition, which would have a lot of feature stories that had been contributed by volunteers in the local community. The issue, this print edition, was supposed to come out at the beginning of April 2020. And it was completely ready to go to print when the lockdown happened. So he just had to abandon this print edition that he'd been working on for months to put out. But subsequently, John Barron received a €5,000 grant from the European Journalism Fund to help him get the print edition back on track. Another editor, Phil Creighton from the Wokingham paper, he had to abandon his usual distribution routes, which included things like local cafes and libraries and council buildings. So instead, he started to distribute through food bank deliveries, through garden centers, which were one of the first sites to open up. And he even managed to get a local Indian takeaway restaurant to hand out copies of the paper when people came to pick up their takeaways. In another case, that of South Leeds Life, so this is a fairly well-established publication and fairly commercially successful. In the local vicar, so the local priest, heard about the difficulties of getting the paper out and actually volunteered to take hundreds of copies of the paper and distribute them when he went to visit people in the community. In another case, that of the Wells Voice, which is in a very wealthy community in England, the editor decided that it didn't make sense to have a normal issue and that he wouldn't get enough advertising funding to get a normal issue of his normally weekly paper out. So instead, he printed a special issue which was sponsored by the council and focused on local services and businesses. In a final case, that of the Broughton Spurtle, that's an actual hyperlocal paper which is focused on a particular neighborhood in Edinburgh, and it's run by volunteers. So that paper tends to be printed at a local printer in Edinburgh. But when the pandemic and lockdown happened, the printer closed down. And so instead, what the members of the production team did was that they simply printed out A4 copies of the paper on their home printers, and
and then they smuggled them into various local outlets in the middle of the lockdown. So one of the things they did was that they posted them in the windows of local news agents. So some of the shops that were allowed to stay open were shops that would sell newspapers, tobacco, and basic groceries. And also one member of the team had a key to local council buildings and managed to post the papers on council building notice boards. So a lot of these editors became very creative about how they were going to continue putting out their papers in the middle of the pandemic. But indeed, it did have very significant financial consequences. So in our survey, 12.5% of respondents thought they may be forced to permanently shut down their outlets. And this number, 12.5%, is actually smaller than what was predicted when the pandemic began. So when the pandemic began, a survey carried out by the Public Interest News Foundation and the Independent Community News Network in the UK showed that 3/4 of the editors reported what they saw as an existential threat of the pandemic, and 94% thought that the pandemic would have adverse financial consequences. So the picture looked actually a little bit better when I did my survey in April of 2021. But at the same time, it really still highlights the very precarious and difficult financial situation of this local entrepreneurial journalism sector. And so the kinds of things that editors responded in our survey was that they would say the coronavirus outbreak has hit our paper-based copy. They said there's a real danger of advertisers not returning and grants drying up. And one editor said that the losses sustained over the past year have reduced the site's reserves to the point where further losses would be unsustainable. So a number of the editors were then in a situation where they had previously covered their expenses by means of the income they generated from their outlets. So they basically relied on their income from the news outlets to survive. And that meant that it was not just an existential threat for the newspapers, the outlets themselves, but also for the editors running them, who were suddenly struggling to pay their mortgages, their bills, and to put food on the table. So some of the editors had to use very creative means to actually survive the pandemic. One particularly enterprising editor was Joe Willis from Richmondshire Today, and he actually recently won an award as the Richmondshire Small Businessman of the Year for 2020. And I'm not surprised that he did, because after COVID hit and he lost his local advertising revenues, he started a whole bunch of new enterprises. So he started a local dating website, which is kind of a slightly strange thing to do in the middle of a pandemic. But nonetheless, he did that. And then he also did a county-wide news site for a different area. And then he supplemented that new income by doing deliveries for a local gin distillery. Another editor, and this example is not on this slide, but another editor basically gave up his job as a newspaper editor. So he stopped publishing the paper and instead started to do deliveries for a local butcher. So he said, I stopped being a newspaper editor and I started delivering sausages. For many of the journalists who were operating these outlets, they had a lot of transferable skills. So they had a lot of skills that they could use in other contexts. And so Mark McGinley from Peckham Peculiar, which is a news site, or actually a newspaper in a London suburb, he stopped publishing print papers for a 3-month period in spring 2020 and instead took on freelance editing work. And that indeed is quite typical of a lot of the editors who basically turned to doing editing and writing work for paid contracts instead of putting out their papers during the pandemic. However, a lot of organizations also saw benefits from the pandemic. So in our survey, 51.9% reported an increase in audience figures and audience engagement, 41.3%. So what we saw overall was that it was really a way of highlighting the importance of local news, because people did seem to increase their news consumption, including local news consumption. Surprisingly enough, a substantial minority of those that we surveyed actually reported improved finances as a result of the pandemic. And this was because a number of these startups or entrepreneurial outlets managed to secure grant funding. And so if you're operating really on a shoestring budget and you make, let's say, about 1,000 or 2,000 pounds a month, if you get a grant for 8,000 pounds from, let's say, the Public Interest News Foundation or the European Journalism Fund or Google or the local council, which were some of the bigger funders, then that makes a very significant difference to your ability to operate and your sustainability. So one example of the impact that this had comes from Kathy Bales from the Isle of Thanet News. So Kathy Bales actually just won an award for her work covering the coronavirus pandemic. She's been operating this site since 2017. Prior to working for the Isle of Thanet News, she was a regional journalist in the same area. And as her working conditions became worse and worse and worse, she decided to launch her own site. And this was in part motivated by the fact that the Isle of Thanet, as she saw it, was no longer being adequately covered by the regional newspaper. So she'd been working flat out since she started this site. She said she was working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. After she received a council grant to help her as a small business owner in the pandemic, she took off her first weekend that she'd ever had off since she launched the site, because she managed to spend some of the money to hire a former colleague to actually produce content for the site. And then she went away and she went to the beach and she was very happy. Now, I now want to turn to this question around having provided this backdrop about how the pandemic actually affected local journalism in lockdown. I want to turn to the bigger questions that you've been exploring around trust and community building. And I want to kind of place that in the context of the pandemic itself as an extraordinary moment for local journalism as well as for the world in general. So obviously for everyone involved, the pandemic represented a challenging moment, not just for their operations, but also for their reporting and ways of working. So James Cracknell, who was then working at a site called Waltham Forest Echo, and now he's moved on to an editor-in-chief role at a group that manages several of these small outlets. He said the following, and became quite emotional when he was talking about this. He said, "I was born in 1985, so it's the biggest major world event that's happened in my lifetime. To be reporting on it at the local level means that at the very beginning, I realized that my job was to literally give our readers information that could save their lives. I was like, bloody hell, that's quite a responsibility, because you had people stuck in their homes, people who were literally unable to open their front door. But they needed that prescription picked up, they needed their food, and they needed someone to look out for them. Literally overnight, you had thousands of people in the community who needed help. So I saw the job of us as a local newspaper to give them the information they needed so they could get the help they needed. So the front pages that we did right at the beginning were unlike any journalism I've ever done before. Those stories we were writing in the beginning were about how can I give people the information they need that could save their lives. Now, in that context, it was very important for the editors that they were trusted both as individuals, but also as reliable and trustworthy news sources in the community. And I think one thing that's particularly important to reflect on in relation to the role of regional and local journalists is that when you work, particularly in local journalism, then an essential part of your relationship to your community and the trust that that community has in you is actually based on the fact that that they know who you are, that you have a long-standing relationship with that community. So in a sense, it's you know, when I think about this from a scholarly point of view, it's very different from how let's say national journalists working in specialist beats, like let's say a politics reporter or a sports reporter, it's very different from how they gain their authority. The authority of local journalists is very strongly premised on having close relationships to their communities, often based on having been geographically in that community for a very long time. And so many of the editors reflected on this importance of cultivating audience trust over time. And so here are a couple of examples of this. This is from, the first one is Phil Creighton from the Wokingham paper. He says, I'm well known locally and people are sending me some contact whenever something's happening, which is a privilege. It's a privilege that people have placed their trust in me. Now, Phil Creighton was working for a long time in journalism in central London for the national press, and he then decided to return to his local community in Wokingham, which is a suburb of London, to start this news outlet. So for him, it was very important to his identity that he was actually based in this community where he was born. And so he says, because I've been part of that community over 20 years or so, I've got that trust. I've got that ability for people to come and talk to me. Another one of the editors, Graham Breeze from My Welsh Pool, he was reflecting on the importance of trust in the local community, also in relation to the ability to generate advertising revenue. He said, I would say we're very well known locally, you know, from having worked and lived in the area all our lives. So people trusted us, you know, there was a trust. And we were able to immediately start generating revenue once we started to go out and meet people. So for him, his ability to, for instance, build relationships with local businesses and to persuade the local businesses to actually put money into his outlet, that was based on the fact that he and his colleagues who were also producing this outlet had been based in that community for quite some time. In the context of the pandemic, the majority of the editors stressed the importance of providing reliable and trustworthy information. And so this was something that was extremely important in terms of cultivating audience trust. And it was also important because many of the editors perceived a real threat from the growing influence of social media in terms of sharing fake news and misinformation about COVID-19. And so along those lines, this was something that was highlighted by these editors. So many of the editors were particularly proud of experimenting with new news formats. So, for example, on the top of the slide, you see the York Mix live blog, and there what you can see is that this outlet experimented for the first time with a live blog to publish breaking news about the pandemic. Sorry. And then similarly, many of the interviewees were very proud of actually being able to share accurate details about local coronavirus cases and deaths, because that information was not very widely available early on in the pandemic. For other editors, the way they saw themselves as gaining the trust of the community was by publishing hard news stories and holding authorities to account. So I already mentioned Hans Martha, or I already mentioned the Shetland News. The editor of the Shetland News, which is quite a well-established and commercially successful outlet on the wealthy island of Shetland. The editor of that publication, Hans Martha, was very proud of getting the story of the first coronavirus cases on the island. Similarly, Kathy Bales, whom I talked about before, the woman who managed to take her first weekend off since she launched the site in 2017. Kathy Bales was very proud of the fact that she managed to publish stories that covered outbreaks and deaths in local nursing homes, even though the local council had been threatening her with a lawsuit if she did publish these stories. But she persisted because she knew that she had the facts right, and she had done a lot of investigation using freedom of information requests. And then finally, a final example is that two organizations based in Wales, Decide.com and Wrexham.com, were proud of the fact that every day they coordinated with each other to ask questions in the daily briefings of the Welsh First Minister. So they saw it as important that these emerging local news outlets were able to play a key role in holding government to account. And I next want to touch on the role of cultivating community. And I think that, one thing to note is that I think that if you work as a local news entrepreneur, what the evidence suggests from our research is that actually celebrating and creating community is really important to how you see yourselves. So in part, what you're doing is to provide reliable information about what's happening in the community so that people will trust the news you provide, but you also, in a sense, have a role as an advocate, promoter, and cheerleader of the local community. So in the context of the pandemic, the majority of our survey respondents believe that their role hasn't really changed since the start of the pandemic. So they still play the same role that they did. But some of the people that we studied described how they, to some extent, changed their journalistic style a bit to emphasize good news stories, both to enhance community cohesion, but also to some extent to manage the emotions of the local community at a time of crisis. So just to give you one example, I'm going to give you a couple more of these examples. But this was a female editor in England who talked about what she saw as the most memorable story she'd done during the pandemic. She said it was quite sweet. They organized across social media that they would play a certain playlist at a certain time. And everyone played these tracks across the village. And they all went out into the street and they all did socially distanced dancing. I got hold of the video and it was our main story. Just something a bit uplifting, even though it was a really gloomy time. And so when I was asking editors about what they saw as the most memorable story that they'd done during the pandemic, many of the examples that they selected were ones about kind of positive things happening in the community that served as a way of cultivating a positive feeling in the community. So some editors talked about local people making personal protective equipment when local hospitals and nursing homes were struggling to get such equipment, so things like visors, masks, and gowns for hospitals. Another one of the editors really enjoyed writing a story where he interviewed a local man who was repairing bikes for free in his shed in his back garden. And several actually mentioned how they reported on the fact that children were writing letters and sending drawings to care home residents. And those are some of the ones you can see here on the slide. Another editor experimented with using Facebook Live videos for the first time. So he wanted to support local businesses and therefore did a trip to the local high street, the local business area. And he went in and interviewed local businesses about the fact that they'd reopened and what it was like for them to reopen, and publish these on the Facebook site for his outlets. And this was quite an interesting example for me, because it's something that happened in an area quite close to me, is that the community of Caerphilly in Wales, where I live, had a very large number of coronavirus cases back in September 2020. As a result of that, that community was put into a local lockdown, as one of the first communities in the UK to be put into a local lockdown back in the autumn of 2020. So the editor of the Caerphilly Observer, Richard Gurner, wrote an editorial which included information about the new rules and stated that we must all play our part in lifting the doom, sort of trying to call a positive community spirit into being, and really to try to manage the emotions of the community at a very difficult time. So just to conclude and allow a little bit of time for questions and answers, what our research has shown is that the pandemic represented significant financial and logistical challenges for these local news entrepreneurs. At the same time, we did see a significant growth in audience engagement. What the editors highlighted was that it's extremely important for the local communities to trust journalists and local journalists in particular. And that trust is something that tends to come from a long-standing relationship based on the journalists living in that community and being quite closely connected to that community. At the same time, what I've also found is that for these local news entrepreneurs, they see it as their role in part to provide reliable information and trustworthy information to their communities in a time of crisis, but it's also in part about actually contributing to cultivating the community to ensure that the emotions of the community are managed in a crisis. More than anything, however, I think that the pandemic has been a moment of crisis which has really highlighted the importance of local journalism. So journalism in general has, I think, been vindicated as a result of the pandemic. Journalism in general has been recognized as extremely important, but local journalism in situations where most people were restricted to staying at home or to staying very close to their homes, local journalism became more important than it's ever been before. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions or please also ask me if there was anything you didn't understand in my presentation as well. Thank you very much.
People are clapping. I don't know if you could hear them. Okay. So Karen, thank you for your presentation and for sharing your research results with us. You surely brought here very interesting perspectives. I know our audience has some questions to make to you, so I'm inviting them to speak up and get on the mic and question you about your research. Ou seja, está aberto o período de questões e de perguntas-respostas para quem desejar discutir estes resultados com a Karen. Aí sim, penso que sim. Mas teste, por favor.
Hello, thank you for your communication, and I'm sorry about my English, but I tried to ask a simple question. That in this crisis, this pandemic crisis, the local or the national government, they done some work, some payment about the crisis in the local journalism, if they have to be paid, if paid some money, some grants, some help for the newspapers can survive in this period. And once
Yes.
again, thank you for your communication. Sorry.
Thanks for that question. I think it's a really important question, actually, because so I think I've hinted at it at different places in my presentation. But basically, what happened was that many of these entrepreneurial outlets were too small to benefit from the government schemes that allowed businesses to what's called furlough staff. So what that meant was they weren't able to benefit from that. They were also unable to benefit from a lot of the grants for small business owners because, again, they were too small for that. But what happened as the pandemic went on was that many local councils and also journalism organizations and funders recognized that, first of all, these outlets were extremely important for local communities, and secondly, they were really struggling financially. So what we saw gradually over the course of the pandemic was that more grants were being offered, and these would tend to be quite small grants on the order of a few €1,000s or pounds, but they would still make a huge difference to the ability of these organizations to survive. Now, another thing that's happened subsequently is that actually both the UK government and the Welsh government, also the Scottish government, have asked the organizations that I work with, the Independent Community News Network and a Center for Community Journalism, have asked for advice on how to better support this sector, and have promised or to put more money into that sector. But it's been very slow in coming, and it has been a real problem for these organizations or for these outlets to survive. So thanks very much for that question, which is really important for these outlets.
I have like a curiosity. Here in Portugal, during the pandemic crisis, the press associations in Portugal, also the Minister of Health, grabbing their information from OMS, had the necessity to put in information to public that they didn't have to be feared to grab paper because of the virus. That happened the same way in UK or not? It's like a curiosity. Another question, do you have seen a lot of, especially print news outlets, to have a definitely different shift from printing to online, becoming an online only? Do you have a lot of that things happen in UK? Thank you.
Right. So with the first question, I think that there was a lot of fear of paper in the early part of the pandemic, and this was one of the things that contributed to deliveries being stopped. But subsequently, they found out that that kind of fomite transmission doesn't happen very often. So I do believe that was that was communicated. Now, in terms of the second question about whether this led to publications going online only, no, it definitely didn't, because in the UK, and this might be true in Portugal as well, but I'm not sure, but in the UK, the main means by which these outlets can make money is if they actually charge for local advertising in the print edition. So print is seen as much more potentially profitable because advertisers are more willing to actually pay good money for print advertising rather than for online advertising. So for that, and also they're more likely to get success through things like membership or subscription schemes if they put out print newspapers. So many of the outlets temporarily stopped publishing print papers just because of logistical challenges, but as soon as they could, they went back to publishing in print again. But in general, in terms of the kind of broader national, regional, and local paper landscape, it is true that increasing numbers of papers have actually gone online only. So that's absolutely a trend in the kind of national picture in the UK, but in terms of the specific outlets that I studied, having a paper edition is a key to profitability.
To point a situation that happened in the study that was published in the Journal of Practice with Joe Jenkins, changing the beat, a study including Portugal and UK. In Portugal, we found a very interesting case that a newspaper that had also local radio and local television, that definitely stopped the print edition and become online only. But then the subscribers put pressure on the news organization to have the print edition back. And then they decided to make a shift, not becoming weekly, that they were before the pandemic crisis, but becoming a news magazine. And it was a very interesting case in the local media scenario in Portugal. But it was in this case.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because what I should clarify is that some of the outlets that I study will tend to have a news website which is updated usually 3 or 4 times a day or sometimes more. But then when they put out print outlets, these come at different frequencies, and many of them actually come out, let's say, every month or every 2 weeks, and some on a weekly basis. So they're not. So those that have print editions are typically not daily newspapers. They're typically either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. And so it's quite a different model from kind of more traditional daily print newspapers.
Hi, my question is about the Independence Community News Network. What's the importance to the Independence Community News Network, to the network, to support the newspapers in the pandemic? What's the actions?
What they did, so the Independent Community News Network is basically a network that's set up to try and provide advocacy and support for the sector. So they did several different things, and I might not remember all of them off the top of my head during the pandemic. So one of the things that they did was to ensure that their members could get press accreditation, so press passes, which meant that they were kind of designated to be out and about, to be allowed to be out and about during the lockdown, so they could continue covering the news. Another thing that they did was that they pressured governments, particularly the Welsh and the Scottish governments, who were more supportive, to provide small grants to these publishers during the pandemic. And then thirdly, what they also did was that, I don't know if you have something like this. So we have something in the UK called statutory notices. And these are basically advertisements that the government is required to put out, or local governments and councils are required to put out about things that they're doing. Now, statutory notices have historically only been published in daily newspapers, but what the Independent Community News Network did was to lobby for statutory notices to also be published as advertising in these community news outlets. That lobbying was successful in Scotland, but not yet in Wales or in England. So they did different kinds of lobbying to try and ensure support. And then they also provided several of the organizations with kind of logistical and practical support about how to actually deal with this situation. So those are some of the things I can remember off the top of my head.
Thank you, Karen. As you said, a lot of things are very similar. What you described and what we know here. And I have a very strict question to put to you, but just now adding a piece of information. Here we have been lobbying from the associations for some years on having a law that obliges that such statutory advertising is published mandatorily in local and regional newspapers. It doesn't work every time as it should, but the principle is there, and it's part of what we should do in associations, is to get more each time, and we are always trying to revise the law to bring new solutions for what is not done. But my question is the following, because it's the same here. You said that the UK government and Wales and Scotland asked associations and entities like the one in which you are participating, what do you think we should do to help those very small or even a little bit bigger local and regional newspapers? It's exactly the same thing here, with a difference. They ask and then they forget. And my question to you, as someone that studies and cares a lot about this, is why do politicians do not understand or do not want to understand that this industry where we are is different in the sense of the size? As you said, it's the same thing here, and because of that, solutions that are welcome for other industries are very, very rarely adopted to our industry. Have you ever thought really about this, and what should we do, we, all of us in Europe, in the world, that believe, as you said, that the more less news you have in local communities, the less they participate in the community life and in the public life. It's a loss for democracy. So why do politicians seem to forget immediately what we tell them, or to feign that they did not understood and they do things completely different from what we explain to them? Sorry, but it's exactly what we feel here.
Yeah, and I really welcome getting that Portuguese perspective as well, and also actually really welcome what you're telling me about the statutory notices, which I think is also kind of very helpful for us in the UK to know that this is actually happening elsewhere. What I wanted to say about the sort of question around the politicians and the political response to this, which I think is quite an important point you raised. So I've given evidence on this to the House of Lords and to the Welsh government. And my sense is that a lot of politicians don't really understand local journalism. Like you said, they don't understand how journalism operates differently, and they also don't understand the importance of local journalism. And so I think that part of the task is kind of a pedagogical one, of actually explaining to the politicians why this is important and what's going to happen, what's the risk of allowing these industries to collapse. And I think, what I also think though, that I'm a little bit more optimistic after having been involved in these political processes for a while, because I do think that there is a growing recognition that the crisis in local journalism is having this impact on local democracy and on civic participation. So this is certainly in the UK, we can see that this is a topic that governments are paying attention to and are trying to do something about, even if it's going incredibly slowly. And even if, like you said, they seem to forget about it. But I think that it is kind of slowly becoming more prominent in the agenda, because it's very clear to the politicians, maybe also because many of them are elected in local constituencies, where they don't get a lot of coverage from local newspapers because there aren't any local newspapers to cover them. So I think this is one thing that makes them more aware of the importance of local journalism, is that they themselves are dependent on actually getting coverage of their actions.
So Karen, I have a question for you, but
Karen, it's me again. It's a kind of a challenge, not only for you, but for all of those that are here in this university. Last week in Portugal you had local elections, and for the first time abstention climbed until very near 50% in local elections, which is not the same thing that happened in the past. We know that 40% of the constituencies, local constituencies, don't have in their territory either a newspaper, either a local radio, or even either a site or a blog even. So I think it's time for us to begin linking the fact that in these communities, I don't know, I've just looked broadly, the fact that there is no newspapers or no radios, no media, affects directly the participation. And then you have another thing. If I would ask you a quiz about how much do you think the Portuguese government invests asking people to go to polls voting, you would be surprised, because it's less than 1 million euros. Is less than 1,000 euros. This year, it was around 50,000 euros, was the amount that the Portuguese government invested in advertising in local and regional press, calling people to go to polls. And then, the Monday after the election, they say, oh, the democracy is in danger because people was at home. And it was not even raining in Portugal that weekend.
No, I think, I guess that's more of a reaction than a question. But what I would say is that in the UK, we've seen more attention to these questions. So at the moment, I know the Public Interest News Foundation is planning a study of exactly that question around the relationship between the presence of local news operators and political participation in the context of the upcoming 2022 local elections. I was also asked to give evidence to Ofcom, so the broadcast regulator, last week, where they asked exactly that question. What is the relationship between local news provision and political participation? So it's something that is definitely on the radar, but perhaps it doesn't result in the investment that the industry needs. And I think that should probably be the focus of any kind of lobbying efforts going forward. You know, it's essentially based, if we have to accept the premise that news and local news in particular is a public good that's essential to a democratic society, but that the evidence seems to suggest that there is not really a viable business model for that to operate. If that's the case, then we need other sources of support, particularly from governments and probably also from bigger online players, Facebook and Google, who are stealing all the advertising revenues. And then, I mean, at the moment, they are also providing some smaller grants for these providers, but they're essentially responsible and should contribute to addressing the problem. And so I should just say that my study, my survey showed that it's only just over 40% of these news organizations have revenues of more than £2,000 a month. So that means essentially it's very difficult to live on the income that you get from these outlets. So there's something about that business model which isn't working, but local news is still really essential. So we need some other solution for supporting it. And one thing I also wanted to say in that respect is that certainly in Scandinavian countries, there's a long history of subsidies for local journalism, including local print journalism. And that has enabled that sector to thrive for a long time. So I think we need to start looking at these kinds of models to recognize that just like we need water and electricity, we also need to have local news.
Thank you, Karen. More questions from the audience? So, Karen, everyone seems to be satisfied. I wanted to thank you very much for this conference and the very enlightening perspectives you brought us. It's a shame you are not at Covilhã sharing the whole conference and mingling with us, because it would be your second time here in Covilhã, and I hope in future conference we'll be able to see you in the flesh when this pandemic thing it's over. So I know the audience wants to clap as a thank you for your conference. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do. Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say you love. It's not for me to say you love.
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's
Go with the brothers, boo, you know how we do.
It's not for me to say.
Ora, em primeiro lugar, queria saudar todos os presentes, saudar o Sr. Vice-Reitor, em representação do Sr. Reitor, saudar, portanto, todos os deputados da Assembleia da República eventualmente presentes, saudar também todos os representantes de associações sectoriais e empresariais que estiveram connosco durante estes dias, durante estes 3 dias, saudar ainda os dirigentes sindicais, as entidades reguladoras, as entidades de autorregulação, os responsáveis pelos órgãos de comunicação social regional, os jornalistas, os professores e alunos que, mesmo não estando agora aqui connosco nesta sessão de encerramento, durante estes dias estiveram connosco em sessões extraordinariamente participadas e que, como tal, merecem ser objeto de um abraço nesta saudação final. Evidentemente que este primeiro Encontro Nacional de Médias Regionais pode ser dito como tendo sido um relativo sucesso na medida em que colocou frente a frente, ou um sucesso na medida em que colocou frente a frente académicos e jornalistas. Eu tive a ocasião de constatar que houve da parte de jornalistas académicos e alunos, representantes de organizações, dirigentes sindicais, uma vontade genuína de participarem e de trocarem impressões entre si. Constatei uma enorme vontade em fazer um diagnóstico fino dos diferentes problemas que ameaçam o setor, e utilizar a palavra ameaçam não me parece naturalmente neste momento uma hipérbole. Reconheci uma enorme capacidade da parte das muitas pessoas que trabalham nesta área, a possibilidade de trazer dados e informações que são importantíssimas para a defesa de um setor que, conforme foi demonstrado, parece estar envolvido numa dinâmica de certa maneira circular. Sem democracia local não existem meios de comunicação social regional, mas sem meios de comunicação social regional a democracia local ficaria mais empobrecida. Sendo que, portanto, há uma função social que está a ser ameaçada e que nem sempre é objeto do reconhecimento com a urgência e a pertinência que mereciam, apesar dos excelentes e bem fundamentados estudos que demonstram a importância dessa função. Daí que, de todos estes 3 dias, aquilo que eu obtive, e permitam-me que eu fale aqui um bocado em título quase pessoal, aquilo que eu obtive foi uma forte vontade em continuar a trabalhar nestas áreas e um forte desejo de tentar reforçar um compromisso que tem sido duradouro por parte da Universidade da Beira Interior em levar a efeito investigações sobre esta matéria em conjunto com as diferentes organizações do setor, com os diferentes centros de investigação que se dedicam a esta área, em conjunto com as organizações representativas dos profissionais e em conjunto com as pessoas que, por razões científicas ou setoriais que as motivam, ou pelas razões cívicas que as motivam, se envolvem no debate desta questão. Continuaremos, pois, para a frente e só agradecemos o impulso, e agradecemos inclusivamente de forma humilde o impulso que a vossa presença trouxe a estes debates. Quero recordar que já levámos por diante cerca de 3, 4 projetos que tiveram a imprensa regional e as questões relacionadas com a imprensa regional no seu centro, que no total já foram algumas centenas de milhares de euros que foram investidos nessa investigação, que isso já mobilizou muitos jornalistas, muitos dirigentes associativos, muitos académicos e muitos estudantes, Penso que esta é uma área forte em que as universidades, nomeadamente as universidades que estão nas regiões de baixa densidade e no interior, devem apostar, e por isso agradecemos também o vosso empenho em ajudar-nos a contribuir para esse desiderato. Muito obrigado.
Ora, muito bom dia. Eu quero, obviamente, fazer minhas também as palavras do professor João Correia. Quero agradecer a todos os presentes e quem tornou possível a realização deste encontro, e foi muita gente, de facto, um empenho extraordinário. Quero também cumprimentar todos os presentes, a Sra. Deputada Cláudia André, muito obrigado pela sua presença, caros colegas, professores, e quando falo em colegas professores e colegas jornalistas, muito obrigado também pela vossa presença. É impossível fazer um resumo do que se passou, obviamente, ainda, um resumo do que se passou aqui nos últimos 2 dias e meio, mas eu considero, e agora falando enquanto jornalista, considero que foi de facto um acontecimento com sucesso assinalável. Um sucesso assinalável porque, enquanto jornalista, eu senti que foi aqui falado aquilo tudo que de facto nos atormenta diariamente nas redações da imprensa local e regional. E foi de facto sem receio, sem condicionamento algum, e foi um debate extremamente rico entre a academia e os jornalistas e também muito sucesso destas coisas atesta-se também pela capacidade com que, ou a vontade com que a plateia intervia e questionava, e de facto foram intervenções, quer deste lado aqui do palco, absolutamente extraordinárias e sobretudo pertinentes. Não houve aqui soluções milagrosas, não há soluções, mas levantou-se aqui as questões fundamentais e era para isso que também este encontro foi de facto criado. E falou-se aqui de coisas... desde a crise da mediação, obviamente a questão da alteração da hierarquização das notícias com este fluxo contínuo que nós temos nas redes e na internet, onde é despejado constantemente informação. Portanto, a noção do que é relevante e o que não é relevante, a questão da edição, a questão da mediação, e uma questão absolutamente fundamental. Falou-se muito, e com razão, da precarização do emprego de jornalista. O fenómeno não é de hoje, naturalmente, não é de hoje. A precariedade no jornalismo não é de hoje, e há aqui colegas que têm muito mais tempo disto do que eu e sabem que... Mas é um processo que está absolutamente visível hoje. Intensificou-se por causa do modelo de negócio tradicional que, neste momento, não funciona ou está em graves dificuldades. E foi aqui colocada a questão... julgo eu ontem à tarde pelo professor Carlos Camponês, de como é que estamos provavelmente naquele momento histórico em que se deve perguntar o que é que a democracia espera do jornalismo, o que é que se espera de nós, o que é que o público espera de nós, e foi aqui dito, vou citar de cor, que então se a democracia entende que o jornalismo é fundamental para si, para o seu funcionamento, então o jornalismo e a democracia têm que se ajudar um ao outro. E é neste ponto histórico em que nós estamos. Quando os alicerces que sustentaram durante muitas e muitas décadas o negócio do jornalismo, vamos lhe chamar negócio, estão em profunda alteração por causa do ecossistema digital, então nós também temos de repensar as formas de financiar o jornalismo. E um jornalismo forte e robusto, naturalmente, deriva precisamente da questão também da economia e como é que se sustenta esse serviço público. É um serviço público que é muitas vezes prestado por privados. Eu podia estar aqui no papel de jornalista a continuar a fazer aquele processo que temos feito aqui ao longo dos últimos dias. Obviamente que não é isso que me compete, nem é isso que eu irei fazer, mas apenas é só sublinhar mais uma vez a importância e a relevância e quem está nas redações e quem está do outro lado a investigar e a estudar estes fenómenos que tanto nos atormentam. Acho que foi de facto um dos encontros mais felizes onde eu já participei a este nível. Foi de facto muito importante enquanto jornalista, e falo aqui neste momento apenas assim, enquanto jornalista, foi de facto absolutamente relevante e importante, porque é precisamente isto que se passa nas redações todos os dias. É isto, nada mais do que isto, e já não é pouco. Também se falou aqui na questão de que os meios, e estou a olhar ali para o Giovanni, que fez um estudo recente sobre o apagão em muitas partes do país que está a ocorrer, e também já foi referido pelo João Palmeiro. Há cada vez mais concelhos neste país que têm apagão noticioso. E isto é importante. É mais do que importante. É importante refletir, debater, mas é importante termos noção do que é que isso representa para as democracias e para as comunidades locais. E é absolutamente grave, como nós sabemos. E o Giovanni fez esse levantamento recentemente e o levantamento não é nada animador. E o processo em curso não promete que a coisa se reverta, pelo menos a breve prazo. Este encontro não terminará por aqui, a discussão irá continuar e estimulamos os jornalistas dos mídias locais e regionais de todo o país a continuarem este debate, até porque iremos recolher os contributos coletivos e por distrito para um futuro livre de datas, visto que não foi possível fazer o debate prévio tal como nós prevíamos. E permitam, por fim, deixar aqui um desafio, que este encontro, cujas sementes foram lançadas agora em 2021, se possa repetir com alguma periodicidade aqui na Universidade da Beira Interior, com futuras realizações para acompanhar também este processo de crescimento das sementes que acabaram de ser lançadas por este primeiro encontro. É o meu desejo. Agradeço mais uma vez a vossa presença. De facto, foram 2 dias e meio pertinentes e neste momento é mesmo isso que precisamos, de pertinência, de trazer aquilo que se passa e que muitas vezes não tem um alcance porque se passam em sítios onde de facto os holofotes da atenção não estão tão focados, como é o caso de centenas e centenas de publicações locais e regionais que não têm o devido reconhecimento e que aqui foi dado voz. Muito obrigado a todos pela vossa presença, por certo iremos encontrar em breve. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, bom dia a todos e a todas. Eu estou aqui em representação do Sr. Reitor da Universidade da Beira Interior, que esteve na sessão de apresentação e que não pôde estar e que me pediu para estar aqui. Sinto-me muito bem, até porque estou no meio de pessoas que conheço e com quem tenho trabalhado ao longo dos anos, da Faculdade de Artes e Letras e do LabCom. Queria cumprimentar, em primeiro lugar, o professor João Carlos Correia, na qualidade de investigador responsável do projeto Remedia Leva. Queria cumprimentar também o professor Nuno Francisco, na qualidade de presidente da comissão organizadora. Queria cumprimentar a senhora deputada Cláudia André pela sua presença, agradecer-lhe. Cumprimentar todos os conferencistas, aqueles que estão presentes e aqueles que estarão a seguir pelo YouTube, não sei, ou por videoconferência, os participantes, o staff, o pessoal que apoiou a organização e que é sempre fundamental neste tipo de organizações. Eu não vou aqui fazer uma intervenção longa, nem teórica, porque eu creio que ao longo destes dias essas intervenções sobre a relevância social e científica do tema já foi abordada. Ainda agora nas intervenções do professor João Carlos Correia e do professor Nuno Francisco foram abordadas novamente questões que têm a ver com essa relevância social e científica do jornalismo e dos meios regionais. Queria apenas focar aqui 2 ou 3 tópicos que têm a ver diretamente com a Universidade da Beira Interior. Nos últimos anos, e sem desprimor para outras instituições de ensino superior, universidades, institutos politécnicos, a UBI tem vindo a constituir-se como um centro de referência na investigação em meios e jornalismo regional. O professor João Carlos Correia referiu aqui um outro projeto, a Agenda do Cidadão, e, portanto, para além deste projeto e de outros projetos que se têm vindo a desenvolver, temos uma pleia de professores e investigadores que têm a ver diretamente com os meios e com o jornalismo regional. O próprio professor Nuno Francisco, que está aqui ao meu lado, como é sabido, é diretor do Jornal do Fundão e é professor investigador aqui no LabCom. Depois, a nível do ensino, para além da investigação, também nós, desde praticamente o início da faculdade em 2000 e depois do LABCO em 2002, que o fundador António Fidalgo escolheu como lema unir a teoria à prática, isto é, quando nós ensinamos meios e jornalismo regionais, nós procuramos ter apenas não investigadores, mas também ter pessoas ligadas à profissão e, se possível, ter professores e investigadores que também são profissionais e vice-versa. E, portanto, esse percurso tem sido também muito importante na Universidade da Beira Interior. Este era o primeiro tópico que eu queria focar. E, portanto, apraz-me, enquanto membro da equipa reitoral, registar isso. Um segundo tópico tem a ver com aquilo que se chama transferência de conhecimento e que eu acho que talvez devesse no ECDU ou nos outros documentos legais deixar-se essa expressão transferência de conhecimento e talvez substituir-se pela expressão partilha de conhecimento ou mobilização de conhecimento. O que é que eu quero dizer com isto? Que a expressão transferência de conhecimento pode dar a ideia de que a universidade é constituída por um conjunto de iluminados que investigam, ensinam e que depois levam o seu produto para a sociedade. Aquilo que nós vimos aqui neste encontro e em outros encontros, e isso também tem sido uma prática da universidade e desta faculdade em particular, é, por um lado, investigar e tentar levar resultados à sociedade, mas, por outro lado, trazer também profissionais. Isto é, se há conhecimento que circula da universidade para a sociedade civil, há também um conjunto de conhecimentos preciosos que circulam da sociedade civil para a universidade. E, portanto, a universidade não tem apenas a ensinar, tem também a aprender. E isso é fundamental nas universidades do nosso tempo e do futuro, porque esta circulação de conhecimento enriquece a sociedade e, no fundo, ela permite um outro desidrato, que é a construção de comunidade. E aí vamos novamente tocar no aspecto essencial dos meios e do jornalismo regional, que é a construção de comunidade. Ainda agora, na discussão que havia com a professora, com a conferencista, se estava a focar esse aspecto, não é? Um jornalismo local é indissociável da democracia local também, e não só. É conhecida a admiração do Alexis de Tocqueville quando chegou à América e descobriu que todas as associações, todas as agremiações, os sindicatos, os grêmios, etc., tinham o seu jornal. Quer dizer, aquilo que o impressionou foi a quantidade de jornais, e não de jornais nacionais, jornais de comunidades, digamos assim, profissionais, locais, etc., etc. E, portanto, esse jornalismo e esses meios são fundamentais. Gostaríamos de ver do poder político, obviamente, isto agora já é uma reflexão um bocadinho, não é dirigida à senhora deputada, mas eu lembro-me que ainda não há muito tempo, altíssimos responsáveis políticos do país lamentavam o facto de não haver mais apoios ao jornalismo e aos jornais, etc., etc. Eu creio que esse lamento foi há 3 ou 4 anos. Depois do lamento, seguiu-se algum comentário e depois o silêncio e o esquecimento. E estamos ainda a aguardar coisas como o porte pago, por exemplo, não é? Coisas como o IVA da publicidade, coisas muito simples que podiam ser levadas a cabo, mas que exigem, quer dizer, não podemos passar o tempo e depois chorar lágrimas de crocodilo, como estava a dizer o professor João Palmeiro. Não podemos chorar lágrimas, a expressão lágrimas de crocodilo é minha. Não podemos chorar lágrimas de crocodilo quando vamos a eleições locais e há cerca de 50% de abstenção. Quer dizer, isto é a conclusão lógica de todo este processo. De maneira que, para não me alongar mais, muito obrigado a todos, aos organizadores, aos conferencistas, aos participantes, aos que apoiaram na parte logística do evento, e espero que daqui a um ano, se possível, estejamos novamente aqui no segundo encontro, em condições já mais físicas e presenciais. Muito obrigado a todos.
de última hora. Um deles, a pedido aqui do Paulo Ribeiro, para os membros da organização se juntarem, juntamente com o João Palmeiro, para tirar uma fotografia. E, em segundo lugar, a recordar que o encontro terminou, mas logo às 15 horas, na Sala de Conselhos da Faculdade de Artes e Letras, haverá um pós-evento designado Ubianos e os Meios Regionais, em que teremos 4 antigos alunos de Ciências da Comunicação, com um percurso nos meios regionais, vão partilhar connosco o seu percurso e a sua experiência. Portanto, estão desde já todos convidados a participar. Muito obrigado.